In order to achieve the top grade for GCSE English Literature, you need to know your text incredibly well. This video will help you with this. Watch me cry, despair and howl as I deconstruct the 2015 BBC version of Priestley's masterpiece and compare it with the original text. There will be 59 screenshots with subtitles from the film and 35 scanned in extracts from the text. Come on then, let's delve into the tiny details of the play and increase your chances of getting that grade 9. Stay tuned, you're watching Schofield and Shakespeare, and by God, I'm in Norway. Act 1. Priestley has very specific instructions for the setting of his action. A smug dining room full of smug people who are going to be slowly but surely brought down a number of pegs and forcefully encouraged to think. So, what does Eileen Walsh, the director of the BBC's 2015 film, decide to do? Well, her film takes us straight to Eva Smith in conversation with an unknown male voice, which will later transpire to be Eric. With gloomy, foreboding synthesized music in the background, we have this excruciating exchange. Do you believe in God? Yes. How can you? I can't believe in people. I have to believe in something or I'd fall. So there we have it. No build-up, no tension. Immediately we have, in excruciatingly cliched language, the tragic story of Eva Smith. Now, Priestley's play certainly wants us to empathise with Eva Smith, hence the existence of comments such as the inspector's "I've had that notion myself from time to time," in response to Sheila's shocked exclamation that her father's female employees aren't cheap labour but actual people. And, most famously, there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives. However, to reveal the overarching tragedy at the very beginning of the play not only detracts from the surprise and build-up of Act 1, but also makes it harder for the audience to feel complicit with the Berlins. Let me explain. Presuming the audience member is middle class and reasonably comfortably well off, part of us surely is going to identify with aspects of the family life portrayed on stage within Priestley's opening moments. We may have fathers who enjoy the sound of their own voices, siblings who drink too much, mothers hell-bent on all family members following social proprieties. And so, when the inspector arrives to infer, over time, that perhaps this family shouldn't be so damn pleased with themselves, then the audience member should also reflect as to whether they think enough about their responsibilities to others less fortunate. But with this version, the reveal has already been made. The focus is already on the abused, unfortunate and disillusioned. Yes, we feel pity for Eva Smith as she utters those pitiable lines, but we are more distant than Priestley intended. One of the joys of watching a work of literature is actually having some unanswered questions, not always knowing every detail, leaving us with the freedom to wonder and speculate. Prior to the arrival of the inspector in Act 1, Mrs. Burling asks to speak to Eric for a minute. Priestley does not show this conversation. Guess what? Walsh, with her BBC film, does. She tells Eric unequivocally, "Please don't have too much port." Even worse, she goes on to say, "You clearly can't take as much as your father." Or Gerald, if it comes to it. Ouch. There are two main things I dislike about this exchange, setting aside the fact that it exists at all. Firstly, there is the overly transparent emphasis on a possible Gerald versus Eric axis, with a seemingly perfect prospective son-in-law on one side, with the more awkward drifting son on the other. In the play, we know that Burling is desperate to prove to Gerald that his family is good enough to justify the marriage between himself and Sheila. Thus, he comes out with transparently sycophantic comments about Port and Finchley, and references his hopes of a knighthood. However, is there any need for Mrs. Burling to get involved with this and add another dimension to Eric potentially feeling inadequate in comparison to perfect prospective son-in-law Gerald? No. Priestley implicitly hints at these feelings, but there is no need for the comparison to be made so explicit. A second point about this added exchange between Eric and Mrs. Burling. In the film, it seems crystal clear that Mrs. Burling has a pretty good idea that Eric has a drinking problem. In Priestley's original text, I feel this is less clear and that Mrs. Burling is more happily deluded about her son's issues with alcohol. Yes, she admits to the inspector that Eric may have drunk too much on that particular evening, but note Priestley's stage direction after Sheila has revealed that Eric has been drinking too much for the last 2 years. She is staggered, so much so that she begs Gerald for a contradiction, which doesn't come, of course. For me, the parents' lack of understanding about their children's perspectives and what they're really like is one of the key themes in the play. The BBC director's decision to show Mrs. Burling actively addressing Eric about his drinking suggests that she knows him better than Priestley actually intended. At the end of this brief exchange, Eric dryly rebukes his mother for nagging and says, in an addition to the original text, "I expect you'll be saying that when I'm 40. She replies, "Well, I may not be here when you're 40, so I'm saying it now." Mrs. Burling having a sense of her own mortality? Really? The same Mrs. Burling who steadfastly refuses to accept she did anything wrong in dismissing pregnant Eva Smith's plea for help. Priestley's Mrs. Burling is someone utterly sure of herself, of her lofty position in society. Priestley's Mrs. Burling does not proactively offer up semi-sentimental offerings to her children. Here's another interesting additional exchange, this time between Sheila and her mother. They are talking about Sheila's engagement to dishy Gerald. "I haven't won a prize," says Sheila, following her mother's "well done." "Well, you have in a way," her mother responds. "You've secured your whole future," she tells her. I just don't agree with this addition, and I don't think Priestley would either. Of course, in 1912 and in 1945, there would have been fewer opportunities for women in life, and so marriage would have been more important in terms of facilitating financial and social security. But in this play, Priestley is less interested in gender issues, or at least they subside into insignificance in relation to his big passion, getting the wealthier, whether they are male or female, to think about the poorer, whether they are male or female. Hence the inspector's addition of John Smith to Eva Smith. The BBC director introducing this particular feminist perspective at this point muddies the waters. Jane Austen may want us to worry about middle to upper class women who need to marry to secure their future, but Priestley emphatically does not. One of the most powerful features of Priestley's play for me is the way the inspector repeatedly emphasises the appalling nature of Eva Smith's suicide. He explains to the male Burlings that the young woman had swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out, of course. She was in great agony. The matter-of-fact way the inspector casually talks about the effect of drinking the disinfectant as burning her insides out is horrifying. No wonder Eric's exclamation is involuntary. How does the inspector first reference Eva Smith's death in the BBC film? 3 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. She'd taken steps to end her own life. The doctors tried to save her, but it was too late. I don't get it. We have an utterly complacent family here who desperately need shaking out of their tails and postresses to think about others. Why would a director remove the shock and power of the emotive language from the inspector's first reference to Eva Smith? In a weird way, I wonder whether this partly stemmed from a realization that, in drama, it's good to keep something back, to withhold key information. And so, having already blown the fact that a suffering young woman would be an important part of the film by showing her looking sad at the opening, perhaps the director is trying to offset this by saving the revelations about the nature of the suicide until the later stages of the play. And indeed, the decision to shift these emotive lines until all of the family realise that they contributed to the death of this young woman has its advantages. They gasp not just at the horrific nature of the death, but the fact that they know that they caused some of her misery. So in the film, the inspector delivers these lines more than an hour into the action. He tells the aghast Burlings, she swallowed a large amount of disinfectant. It burnt her insides out. She died in agony. But isn't the point of the play that Priestley wants us to respond emotionally and sensitively to the suffering of all within the working classes, not just those we have been directly involved with? He wants us to care more broadly. Sitting in the audience, Priestley wants us to feel for this girl as intensely as possible as soon as we have heard about her death. He also wants us to watch the reactions of the full of themselves family on stage, to see whether they are also responding humanely and compassionately. By slightly diluting these lines, the BBC director is unwittingly safeguarding the family's complacency. Sadly, suicides are relatively common, but suicides by drinking disinfectants are not. The director of the BBC film makes another irritating, unnecessary change when referring to the strike at Berlin's factory. In the original text, the strikers are led by Eva Smith, and the strike happens immediately after the holidays. Berlin describes it as a pitiful affair, following which he dismisses the 4 or 5 ringleaders who started the trouble. What happens in the BBC film? Well, Berlin recounts in exasperation. They knew what they were doing. They waited until we had a huge order to deliver. The biggest one we'd ever had. The inspector, unsurprisingly, interprets this action positively. So one might say they were clever. But this alteration does not ring right with me and falsely invests the desperate strikers with a sense of tactical nous they don't have. Priestley surely wants us to recognise just how desperate things are for so many of the working classes and those striking here. That sense of desperation is diluted unhelpfully if the strikers display the same sense of initiative and agency as implied in the film. Put simply, for me, Priestley feels as though the workers are too poor and repressed to be clever. Here is another irritating change made to the original text. Priestley states simply that the collective wanted a pay rise from about 22 and 6 to 25 shillings a week. And the film, well as ever, the director cannot resist from meddling. Berlin is shown attempting to negotiate with Eva Smith within the empty, abandoned factory. "How about I make you leading operator?" he asks tactically. "You'll have 10 girls working under you," he continues. "I'll pay you your 25 shillings, he says. "You can call them back and we'll get that order out." Eva's response surprises Berlin. "I'm afraid I can't accept that," she says determinedly. "It has to be for all of us." Berlin, of course, refuses to offer a higher rate of pay for all and promptly publicly sacks Eva Smith when the strikers give in and return dejectedly to the factory. What the BBC director is doing here is unnecessarily making Eva even more of a martyr than she is in the original text. In this version, she not only stands by her fellow workers, but refuses to allow herself to be effectively bribed. She follows the admirable socialist ideology of thinking of the collective rather than the original. Priestley, of course, is a socialist, but this unnecessary addition is in some ways illogical. Why shouldn't Eva Smith accept a pay rise if she is going to take on a degree of management responsibility in terms of looking after 10 girls? In the original text, Priestley has, of course, revealed that the foreman was ready to promote Eva Smith into what we call a leading operator, head of a small group of girls. Transferring this line to Berlin means that Eva's work ethic and ability is unwittingly undermined. Berlin is clearly promoting her primarily to shut her up, which is not the case in the original text. Thus, in some ways, a well-meaning change has the opposite effect to that intended, that of detracting slightly from Eva Smith's character. One final reference to the presentation of the Berlin-Smith strike dispute within the film. In the original text, Eva Smith is described as having had a lot to say. The BBC version decides to include this feminist angle. Eva Smith rebukes Berlin. "You wouldn't get away with paying us so little if we were men." Again, I just don't agree with this change. It unhelpfully dilutes Priestley's overarching support and compassion for the working classes in general, not just working class women. Remember, John Smith's matter as much as Eva Smith's. Yes, the women or woman in Priestley's text are susceptible to being taken advantage of sexually. Nonetheless, Priestley's main focus is getting society as a whole to think more deeply about their responsibility to others, male or female. Whereas in the film, the comment about Burley not being able to get away with paying men so poorly falsely implies that the working class male may have had a comparatively charmed, carefree existence. Following on from the unnecessary additions to the Eva-assisted strike at Berlin's factory, the director of the BBC film irritates yet again with this moment. Gerald has just made an awkward comment following the revelation that Sheila brutishly got Eva Smith sacked at Millwoods. Then Eric sums up the situation as a bloody shame. Eric then adds, "She must have loved our family." Mr. Berlin is successful in getting Eric to be quiet, and then his son then continues, "I wonder if she made the connection between." The incomplete sentence is left hanging in the air, but it is clear that Eric is speculating about whether Eva realised that the daughter of the man who sacked her at Berlin's forced the manager of Millwoods to dismiss her. There's just no need for this to be stated so explicitly. What does Priestley do in the original? Well, the line from Eric referring to the dismissal of Eva Smith being a shame actually stems from earlier in the play. He's talking about Berlin dismissing Eva from the factory rather than Sheila's actions at Millward's. In the original, you can see a rare example of the inspector's dry sense of humour as he deliberately misinterprets Eric's line to refer to his lack of golfing experiences, as opposed to a young woman losing her job. So Priestley certainly doesn't get Eric to think from Eva's perspective so publicly and so early on in his play. Surely Eric hasn't matured or evolved enough for that yet. Furthermore, the use of the word connection seems to me to too explicitly signpost the fact that all family members are going to be linked to this tragedy in some way, and thus distracts from the audience experience. Yes, the more discerning member of the audience will clock onto the fact that the inspector seems to be slowly working his way around all members of the family. But it is infinitely preferable for us to work this out for ourselves, rather than have such a grotesque hint inserted by the director, as is the case here. There is another rather strange addition to Priestley's original script, just prior to the inspector revealing that Eva Smith supposedly changed her name to Daisy Renton. The inspector explains, things were extremely difficult for her after she left Millward's. They couldn't give her a reference in the light of what happened. So, after several months of loneliness and near starvation, she decided she had no option but to try something else. So she changed her name. She changed her name to Daisy Renton. How does this compare to the original text? Let's take a look. Eva Smith lost her job with Birding and Company because the strike failed, and they were determined not to have another one. At last she found another job, under what name I don't know, in a big shop, and had to leave there because you were annoyed with yourself and passed the annoyance on to her. Now she had to try something else. So first she changed her name to Daisy Renton. The versions are similar, and although Priestley makes no mention of the fact that Eva wasn't able to be given a reference, perhaps difficulties in obtaining references could be inferred by Priestley's suggestion that she may have given a different name to join Millward's. However, it is the addition of the emotive language about Eva having several months of loneliness and near starvation which surprises me. So let's get this clear. At the beginning of the play, the director initially has the inspector being very factual about Eva Smith's suicide, with no mention made of the swallowing of disinfectant and the amount of agony she was in. Yet here the BBC version decides to add the grossly unsubtle reference to several months of loneliness and near starvation, which anyone with an ounce of compassion would be able to infer from the chain of events re-summarised by the inspector here. Very simply, why does this director need to treat us all like idiots? Time for yet another annoying moment from the film. Let's set the scene. The inspector has just revealed that Eva Smith changed her name to Daisy Renton. Gerald's reaction makes Sheila suspicious, and she quickly instinctively realises that Gerald has had an affair with her. So she wants to speak to him about it privately. That makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is the addition shown on screen now. Sheila says, "I want to talk to Gerald alone, except for the inspector." I'm sorry? She's just found out that her previously seemingly perfect fiancé has had an affair, and she wants a hectoring stranger there? Really? What we're seeing here is the director confusing the idea that Sheila has increasingly during the day, that the inspector as a force cannot be resisted. He will find out their inner secrets willy-nilly. Hence near hysterical exclamations such as this one at the very end of Act 1. Why, you fool, he knows. Of course he knows. But just because Sheila rates the inspector's ability to root out the truth does not mean that she wants him embarrassingly present when she is at her most raw and emotional, as she is at the end of Act 1 once she has learnt that Gerald cheated on her during the previous summer. Hence her abrupt request for Eric to take the inspector to the drawing room in the original text.
Act 2.
Next up, let's have the rather strange moments inspired by Gerald's forced confession about how he first met Daisy Renton. In the original text, Gerald explains that he entered the Stalls Bar at the Palace Variety Theatre only to see Daisy trapped by fat old Joe Meggerty. So he rescues her and tells Joe Meggerty some nonsense, that the manager had a message for him or something like that. Got him out of the way, and then told the girl that if she didn't want any more of that sort of thing, she'd better let me take her out of there. She agreed at once. Now, the BBC film, probably quite rightly, uses flashbacks to show the family interactions with Daisy, and thus ensures the action is far more varied than just the audience watching people getting slowly more and more agitated around a dining room table. However, look at the language Gerald uses to save poor Daisy. "You've been looking after my girl for me, I see. I'm indebted to you." "I'm so sorry I'm late, darling. Ready to go?" So in Priestley's original text, the pretext is some nonsense about the manager having a message for him. In this film, Gerald is the gentleman meeting either his fiancée or his mistress. Either way, the woman is someone to be respected and treated with the utmost civility, hence the deeply apologetic tone. Now, this pretext works, and certainly it is true that Gerald treats Daisy reasonably well, as confirmed in the inspector's later remark that he at least had some affection for her. However, surely Gerald's use of language in this film once again gives a misleading idea about the amount of respect in general offered by men towards women like Eva Smith or Daisy Renton. Would the son of Lord and Lady Croft really refer to a woman hanging out in a venue notorious for hosting women of the town, i.e. prostitutes, as "my girl," even if this could potentially refer to her as his regular girl, i.e. his mistress, rather than his above-board girlfriend or fiancée? Would posh toff Gerald really be so egalitarian and simpering to a woman found at a favourite haunt of women of the town? Please forgive me. I'm afraid that was the most shocking liberty. I could never bear to see a damsel in distress. And how about this codswallop? He offers to take her out for dinner to celebrate our escape from the beast. Oh, please! Priestley wants to show us the selfish, unthinking, inward-looking attitudes of the middle to upper classes in relation to those struggling. There's no way he would have envisaged Gerald being so sickeningly light-hearted and kindly persuasive towards Eva or Daisy. Yes, he is more attractive than the fatty, and yes, he uses his contacts to give her a comparative period of happiness. But that doesn't make his portrayal here as the perfect, considerate, good-humoured hero ring true. He is too much of a selfish, smug idiot for that. When Gerald and Daisy arrive at his friend's nice little set of rooms, in the BBC film, Daisy is so delighted that she comes up with this ridiculous simile. "I feel like Goldilocks. I need another please here. Please." Yes, Priestley uses fairy tale imagery once around this point in the play, but crucially Sheila is speaking with sharp sarcasm when she declares that secret shagger Gerald was the wonderful fairy prince. Whereas there is no sarcasm at all here from Daisy, and for me, such a silly, light-hearted simile diminishes a figure who, in Priestley's text, is remarkably brave and full of integrity as she battles social injustices and men. Look how she took a leading role in the strike disputes at Berlin's factory. And look how noble and determined to be self-sufficient she is when falling pregnant with Eric's child. Why in God's name would she come up with this kind of tripe?
Act 3.
Later on in the play, there's an interesting stroke excruciating moment in which Eric is shown sitting up after presumably having had sex with Eva. He asks this crass question, "What's your name?" thus making him look even more of an insensitive, selfish creep than he is in the play as a whole. Eva then replies, "I don't know." As ever with this BBC production, you can see what the director is trying to do, and you can see that these amendments stem from an understanding of an aspect of the play. The idea is all too transparent. Eva has got so worn down by the repeated blows and cruel setbacks hurled at her by patriarchal, prejudiced society that she no longer has a sense of who she is. Her identity is clearly so unimportant to others that she herself no longer has the energy or inclination to affirm it herself. However, one of the delightful ambiguities of the play is the question as to whether the Berlin family were involved with just one girl, which, let's face it, is a rather improbable scenario, or a number of girls duplicitously linked by the inspector. Hence Gerald's hopeful, excited question in Act 3. The ambiguity about whether Eva Smith may actually be an amalgamation of a number of different abuse put on girls enables Priestley to make the point that there is a great deal of suffering out there amongst the working classes. This situation is not a cruel one-off tragedy. In the BBC production, Eva Smith's failure to assert her identity certainly confirms just how downtrodden she has become. But the audience unquestionably knows that Eva Smith is just one person. We've seen flashbacks of her every single time with different family members. And the effect of this is to unwittingly focus overly on her personal tragedy, rather than the broader tragedy within society as a whole, perpetrated by Burlingtons, Crofts, and perhaps those sitting in the audience. In Act 3, we see a clear divide between the different generations, with Mr. and Mrs. Burling cock-a-hoop at Gerald's revelation that the inspector wasn't a genuine police inspector, while Sheila and Eric have become soberer, more reflective, more responsible citizens. Gerald is probably somewhere in between. The BBC production includes this exchange between Mr. Burling and Eric. The former has just asked Eric to provide details of the accounts he stole from, and then he says, "I'll be lucky if I can keep you out of prison." "Then I'll go to prison," responds Eric, who then storms out and is followed by Sheila. They have this exchange outside the dining room. "I'll do anything to stop myself from turning into another one of them," Eric says. Sheila replies, "All they care about is covering this up." And then Eric comes out with this classic, "I hope there is a war. I hope it finishes them," he adds petulantly. How does this compare to the original? Well, Eric and Burling are shouting at each other, and Burling suggests that some fathers would have kicked him out of the house by now. Eric just replies that he doesn't give a damn, which is very different to the more melodramatic lines in the BBC production. "Then I'll go to prison." Is Priestley's Eric really drunk or defiant enough to come out with such a statement? Is he really strong enough to suggest that he would be prepared to swap his comfortable lifestyle for the deprivations of prison just because he is infuriated by his father's failure to see the bigger picture in relation to the inspector's visit? Similarly, the BBC film adds the line on screen now in which he hopes there is a war. Of course, war has been mentioned very early on in the play. In Act 1, when Berlin, with the benefit of hindsight, showed himself to be hopelessly complacent and misguided in his predictions about war. So to some extent, this edition makes contextual sense. However, what doesn't make sense to me is that Eric would, in any shape or form, actively hope for war to happen or say this. Yes, he is upset. Yes, he's feeling emotional following the events of the evening, which included the suggestion that his own mother may have contributed to the death of his unborn child. But it is one thing going against your father and shouting that as a family they need to take some responsibility for a young woman's death. And it is quite another calling for a war to take place, one in which he would almost certainly be drafted to fight. And for this war to somehow finish off his parents or kill them. This is pure nonsense. Yes, we all say things in the heat of the moment, but Priestley's Eric is not strong enough, not vindictive enough, not bitter enough to tell his sister that he would love a war to kill off his selfish, inward-looking parents. Remember, this is the same Eric who actively seemed to be seeking his father's approval just an hour or so previously. Remember him trying to enthusiastically back up his father, albeit at exactly the wrong time? By Jove, yes! And as you were saying, Dad, a man has to look after himself. Such melodrama is unhelpful, unnecessary, and out of place within Priestley's world of Inspector Calls. The ending to the BBC film is interesting. We see the inspector looking mournfully up towards Eva Smith's room as she makes her final fateful journey. We see her suffering face as she retches in hospital, surrounded by medical staff desperately trying to save her. We then see Inspector Gould by her side, holding her hand as she dies. The camera then shows the same shot again, this time with Inspector Gould having vanished. The clear implication being that he was some kind of otherworldly, supernatural, omniscient, benign, ghoul-like figure. It's clever and moving. In Priestley's original text, it is indeed clear that there is something different and otherworldly about the inspector. And this is something Sheila picks up on early on. The inspector's surname sounds like Ghoul, which is defined as a spirit, albeit a generally evil one. But once again, the transformation from play to film results in us losing some of the ambiguity, some of the complexity. In the ending to Priestley's playtext, Berlin goes to answer the telephone, only to find out that a girl has just committed suicide by drinking disinfectant. Just at the very moment they're beginning to relax, the play ends with the family more precariously placed than they were when the first so-called inspector arrived. Both Berlin's phone call to Colonel Roberts and Gerald's phone call to the infirmary are likely to be seen as deeply suspicious. This adds a further dimension to the family's culpability, whilst the audience in Priestley's original will have a number of unanswered questions. 1. Who exactly was the original inspector? 2. Is the dead girl the same girl mistreated at various stages of her recent life by the Berlin family, or another girl altogether? Could the Berlin family be about to be framed and punished for their generic lack of empathy and compassion towards those less fortunate and wealthy, as opposed to their specific selfish actions to one individual? No such questions and ambiguities in the film, alas. This is a tragedy about one person, and try as the inspector might to get the family to think more broadly, the audience is left with this single, haunting image in our minds.
When I think of those pupils who have achieved the highest grades for GCSE English Literature, they've generally had one thing in common: a real enthusiasm for the text and a really detailed understanding. So the aim of this video has been to give you a more detailed understanding by comparative outlook. I hope it's been useful. Many thanks for watching Schofield on Shakespeare.